There is a photograph that almost no one has seen. It was taken in 1971 in a rented room in Accra, Ghana, by a journalist whose name history has not preserved. In the photograph, Maya Angelou is sitting with her back to the window. The light comes from behind her, equatorial light, brutal and honest, the kind that does not flatter, the kind that simply reveals. She is looking at something outside the frame, not at the camera, not at the journalist, at something else entirely, something internal, or perhaps something so far in the distance that the walls of the room cannot contain it. People who study her face in that photograph say she looks like she is listening, not to the room, not to 1971, to something underneath all of that. Here is what we know about the science of genetic memory. And here is where it gets uncomfortable for the tidy categories of modern rationalism. The human mitochondrial genome, which passes entirely through the maternal line, unchanged, from mother to daughter, across thousands of years, carries within it a kind of biological timestamp, a molecular notation of where your mother's 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 mother, reaching back 40 generations, 60 generations further, was standing when a specific mutation occurred. Not metaphorically standing, physically standing, on specific ground, under a specific sky, speaking a specific language to a specific child who would carry that molecular notation forward through every catastrophe history had prepared for them. Maya Angelou, in that photograph, listening to something the walls could not contain. She was not imagining. She was receiving. And what she was receiving had traveled further than the Atlantic, further than the slave ships, further than the auction blocks of Charleston and the cotton fields of Lafayette County, Arkansas. It had traveled through a corridor of maternal transmission so ancient that when you trace it backward on a map, you arrive not at a country, but at a civilization, one that the European world spent 3 centuries pretending did not exist, because acknowledging its existence would have made the crime of destroying it too enormous to process. We are going to name that civilization. But first, we need to talk about a name that disappeared. The name that disappeared was not Maya Angelou's name. It was not even the name Johnson, which her father carried into the family like a borrowed coat, practical, anonymous, designed to attract no particular attention from the machinery of American racial administration. The name that disappeared was older than Johnson, older than Arkansas, older than the United States itself. It disappeared sometime between 1850 and 1870 in the county records of Lafayette County, in the specific administrative silence that falls over every African-American family tree at the exact moment you cross that threshold from the era of freedom into the era of documented enslavement. You are following the line backward, grandmother to great-grandmother to great-great-grandmother. And then the handwriting changes, the document changes, the entire nature of the archive changes, and the name is simply gone. Not crossed out, not corrected. Gone. Replaced by a number, an age, a sex designation, a mark in a column under the name of the person who owned them. The person who owned them had a name. It is in the record, written carefully, with the full dignity of proper noun status. The person they owned did not. That asymmetry is not an accident of record-keeping. It is the record-keeping. It is the system describing itself with perfect clarity. But here is the thing about names that disappear into that silence. They do not actually cease to exist. They go underground. They travel in other containers. They move through the culture in the way that water moves through limestone, invisibly, under pressure, reshaping everything from the inside without leaving a visible trace on the surface, until one day a spring opens in an unexpected place, and the water comes up clear, and cold and tasting of a geology that was forming long before anyone currently living was born. The name that belonged to Maya Angelou's maternal ancestors before the archives swallowed it, before the slave schedule reduced them to inventory, was being spoken somewhere in West Africa at the exact same moment it was being erased from the American record. The same year that a census enumerator in Lafayette County was writing a number in a column instead of a name. A mother in a compound near the Bight of Benin was speaking that name, or its root, or its echo, to a child who would never know that a branch of her family had been cut and carried across the water and planted in catastrophic soil, and had somehow, impossibly, continued to grow. The DNA remembers what the archive refused to write down. The DNA test that would eventually map Maya Angelou's ancestral origins with molecular precision did not exist when she was alive. She died in May 2014, at her home in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, at the age of 86, and the genetic genealogy platforms that can now distinguish between a Yoruba woman from Oyo State and a Mende man from the Sierra Leone interior with reasonable statistical confidence were, at that point, still refining their reference population databases, still arguing among themselves about methodology, still building the enormous comparative architecture that makes ancestral specificity possible. She never saw her own results. She never sat in front of a screen and watched a map of West Africa light up with the specific geography of her biological inheritance. What she had instead was the feeling, that unverifiable, inarguable, maddening feeling that she described in different language, in different decades, but that always pointed in the same direction, toward the coast, toward the continent, toward something she called home, without being able to produce a deed or a document to justify the claim. But the feeling was not the beginning of the story. The feeling was the end of a very long chain of transmission. And to understand what was being transmitted, you have to go back to the specific geography that the DNA points toward, not as a spiritual destination, not as a metaphor for belonging, but as an actual physical place with an actual physical history that was in full, complex living operation for centuries before the first European ship appeared on the horizon and changed the calculation of everything. The genetic signal in Maya Angelou's maternal line traces to the Niger Delta region and its immediate interior, to the cultural and linguistic world that scholars of West African history have spent the last half-century reconstructing from oral tradition, archaeological evidence, and the administrative records of the kingdoms themselves. This is not a peripheral or poorly documented region of African history. This is one of the most densely inhabited, most commercially active, most politically sophisticated corridors of the pre-colonial African world. The Niger River, which drains an area larger than Western Europe, was not simply a geographic feature. It was an artery. It moved people, goods, ideas, languages, and gods across a landscape of extraordinary ecological and cultural diversity, connecting the savanna empires of the interior to the forest kingdoms of the south and the coastal trading networks that linked them ultimately and fatally to the Atlantic world. The people who lived in this corridor before the trade arrived knew exactly who they were. They had been knowing it for a very long time. The Yoruba city of Ile-Ife had been old for 500 years before the first Portuguese caravel rounded the Cape of Good Hope. That fact requires a moment of stillness to absorb properly, because the European intellectual tradition has spent so long treating African history as something that begins at the moment of European contact, as if the continent were a stage that existed in darkness until a Western spotlight found it, that even people who consciously reject that framework sometimes find themselves unconsciously measuring African civilization against the clock of European arrival. So let us set that clock aside entirely and use a different one. When the artists of Ile-Ife were producing the naturalistic bronze and terracotta portrait heads that would later confound every European who encountered them, the heads with their extraordinary specificity of individual feature, their calm authority, their technical mastery of a casting process that requires precise knowledge of metallurgy, heat, and the behavior of molten metal in ceramic molds. The Norman conquest of England had not yet happened. William had not yet crossed the Channel. The Tower of London did not exist. Oxford University would not be founded for another century. The artists of Ile-Ife were not working in response to anything European, were not influenced by anything European, were not aware of anything European. They were working inside a tradition that had been developing on its own terms, according to its own aesthetic philosophy, for generations. The faces they made in bronze were the faces of people they knew, people they considered worth the extraordinary labor of permanent commemoration, people whose individual humanity was so self-evident to the civilization that produced them that it required no argument, no justification, no framework borrowed from anywhere else. This is the world that the transatlantic slave trade did not destroy completely, but bent catastrophically out of its own trajectory. And the bending began not with a single dramatic event, but with a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the economics of the coast. The moment when European demand for labor in the Americas intersected with the existing internal African trade in war captives and created something neither system had produced alone: an industrial-scale, transatlantic, racially codified market in human beings that would operate for 400 years and move somewhere between 12 and 15 million people across the ocean, of whom approximately 2 million died in transit and were thrown into the water, and of whom the survivors arrived in the Americas, carrying in their bodies the entire accumulated inheritance of civilizations that the receiving society was institutionally committed to pretending did not exist. The plantation needed their labor. It did not need their history. It was, in fact, actively threatened by their history, because a people who know they come from kingdoms do not easily accept the condition of property. The Yoruba city of Ile-Ife was already ancient when Rome was young. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is a stratigraphic fact, confirmed by archaeological excavations that have been ongoing since the 1950s, and that keep producing evidence of continuous, sophisticated urban habitation stretching back further than the most optimistic pre-colonial African historians initially dared to claim in print, because claiming it meant arguing against a century of European academic consensus that had decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with evidence, that sub-Saharan Africa had no urban history worth measuring against the civilizations of the Mediterranean. The excavations at Ile-Ife did not argue back against that consensus politely. They simply kept producing bronze, terracotta, iron, glass beads. The physical residue of a city that had been thinking carefully about itself, representing itself, debating the nature of its own origins in art and ritual and political architecture, for longer than most European capitals have existed. What those bronzes show, when you look at them without the distorting lens of what you were taught to expect from African art, is an almost aggressive individualism. Each face is specific. Each face belongs to a particular person. The artists of Ile-Ife were not making types or symbols or generic representations of royalty. They were making portraits, committing the specific geometry of a specific human face to bronze with a technical confidence and a philosophical intention that says, without ambiguity, This person existed. This person mattered. This person's particular configuration of features was worth preserving against the erosion of time. The civilization that produced those bronzes understood something fundamental about individual human dignity that the civilization which would later enslave its descendants had not yet fully worked out in its own political philosophy and would not work out, and in many respects has still not fully worked out, centuries later. Maya Angelou's first autobiography begins with her own face, with the problem of her own face. Too dark, she believed as a child, too broad, too far from the images of beauty that the American visual culture of the 1930s and 1940s presented to her as the standard against which all faces should be measured. She dreamed, she wrote, of waking up one morning with blue eyes and blonde hair, of having been the white girl she was convinced she must secretly be, waiting inside the wrong body. That particular cruelty, the internalization of a visual standard designed by a culture that had spent 3 centuries insisting that her face was not worth commemorating, was one of the deepest wounds that slavery and its aftermath inflicted, not with whips, but with mirrors. With the systematic removal of every image, every artwork, every bronze portrait that might have told her, before she had to spend decades figuring it out herself, your face was always worth casting in metal. Your face was always the subject. Your face was always the point. The artists of Lineage knew her face. They had been casting it in bronze for 1,000 years before she was born. The photograph from 1971 is still there. Maya Angelou, back to the window, equatorial light behind her, looking at something outside the frame, looking at something the walls of the room cannot contain. We know now what she was receiving. She was receiving the bronze faces of Lineage, traveling forward through 1,000 years of survival and catastrophe to find her own face looking back at her. She was receiving the Niger River, moving through its ancient corridor, carrying gods and languages and the names of kings through a landscape that the archive tried to erase, but that the body refused to forget. She was receiving the specific molecular notation written into her mitochondrial DNA by a maternal ancestor who was standing on West African soil at the exact moment that notation was made permanent, standing there, speaking a language, looking at a sky, being fully, completely, documentably human in a way that no slave schedule and no property ledger and no plantation inventory could retroactively undo. The archive said she was a number. The DNA said she was a civilization. She spent her entire life writing toward the truth that the science would eventually confirm, that the self cannot be owned, that identity travels in containers the oppressor cannot see, that the voice carries inside it the full geological weight of every ancestor who used their voice before you, reaching back past the paper wall, past the ships, past the auction blocks, all the way to a city where artists cast individual human faces in bronze because they understood, at the level of cultural philosophy, that each face was the whole world. Maya Angelou knew this. She felt it before she could prove it. Now we can prove it. The bird always knew where the song came from. We just needed the science to catch up to the singing.